About 3-4 minutes before it crashes again. Wrong button. There we go. And that. And this. Exciting, but... Eee, what a mess. Alright, and what are we going to listen to? Oh, let's finish up these stories.
Living in Chico, California. On a Saturday morning in 2024, officers arrested him on murder charges. As investigators dug into Sanfratello's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. Just 2 years after Teresa's disappearance, he'd been charged with attempted murder, and burglary, and the brutal stabbing of his ex-wife and her 14-year-old daughter. He served more than 15 years in prison for the attack and was later charged in federal court for the theft of U.S. government property. After all these years, justice had finally caught up. For Teresa's brother Russell, the arrest brought a mixture of grief and closure.
He had a lot of hurt and damage done to her, but she still remained a loving person.
He believes she's finally found the peace that eluded her in life. 42 years after she vanished in the woods, Teresa Peroni's voice is no longer lost. On the evening of October 13th, 1970, just 4 days before her 18th birthday, Helen Claire Frost told her sister Sandy that she was going for a walk and stepped out into the crisp autumn air in Prince George, British Columbia. She never returned. What began as a quiet stroll quickly became one of Canada's most enduring mysteries, and what many now consider the first case linked to the region's notorious Highway of Tears. Helen was born on October 17, 1952, in Reigate, England, to Dennis and Daphne Frost. Her father was a decorated Green Beret who served with the British Commando Brigade for 12 years and then worked on the London docks during World War II. In 1956, hoping for a better life, the Frost family immigrated to Canada and eventually settled in Nanaimo, British Columbia, where Dennis found work as a sweeper operator. By 1969, Helen had moved to Prince George in search of independence and opportunity. That November, her younger sister Sandy joined her, and the two shared an apartment on the 1600 block of Queensway with a young woman named Darlene and her baby.
What can you do with cricket?
Don't use it.
With a young woman named Darlene and her baby. Helen worked a variety of jobs to support herself, bussing tables at the Hudson's Bay Company cafeteria, picking berries, and even painting gas stations along Highway 16. But in the spring of 1970, Helen's life took a drastic and heartbreaking turn. Unmarried and pregnant, she left for a home for unwed mothers in Kamloops, where she gave birth to a daughter, Sandra Jeanette, on May 13th. The baby's father, Stefan Grumpner, abandoned Helen shortly after the birth. Alone and overwhelmed, she was forced to place her daughter for adoption, a decision that left a deep emotional scar. That summer, Helen tried unsuccessfully to regain custody. Sandy recalled seeing her sister exit the social worker's office in tears, devastated and silent. The subject was never brought up again, but the weight of that moment lingered. Helen's relationship with Stefan had ended, and she seemed increasingly adrift in the months that followed. Still, on the night she disappeared, Helen didn't seem out of sorts. When Sandy returned from coffee with a friend around 8 p.m., Helen asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Sandy declined, citing the cold weather. So Helen set out alone around 8:20 p.m., wearing a navy blue nylon coat with fake fur trim and blue pants. She didn't take her purse or any money. She left behind all her belongings and was never seen again. By October 15th, Sandy knew something was wrong. Helen wasn't the kind of person to disappear without explanation. She contacted the RCMP, but the response was routine and dismissive. At the time, missing teenage girls were often assumed to be runaways, and valuable time was lost in the early stages of the investigation. Few leads emerged. One unconfirmed tip suggested Helen had been seen hitchhiking from a Husky gas station, but that report was never substantiated. Extensive searches of nearby forests, rivers, and roads turned up nothing. What makes Helen's case even more significant is its timeline. She vanished along Highway 16, a stretch that would later become infamous as the Highway of Tears, where dozens of women, many of them indigenous, have disappeared or been murdered over the last 5 decades. In fact, I've done a number of videos about these stories. Helen's disappearance is believed to be the first documented case along that route. Despite this, the RCMP declined to include her case in Project EPANA, the special task force investigating Highway of Tears victims. Officials said her case didn't meet the criteria, a decision that continues to frustrate her family. But in 2018, nearly 50 years after Helen vanished, a remarkable twist brought her story back into the light. Her daughter, now an adult known as Michelle Johnston, had begun searching for her birth mother using DNA testing and genealogy research. That search led her to Sandy and to the heartbreaking truth that her mother had vanished without a trace just months after her birth. Today, more than half a century later, Helen Claire Frost remains missing. Her fate is unknown, her story unfinished. She was the first, but tragically not the last, to disappear along Canada's most infamous highway, a place where silence stretches for miles and justice has yet to arrive. On the night of January 3rd, 1997, in the quiet, affluent suburb of Bellevue, Washington, a senseless act of violence would unravel a family and shock the nation. What began as a late-night meetup between teenagers escalated into one of the most brutal family slayings in Pacific Northwest history. The killers were just 17 years old and claimed they did it simply to feel what it was like. The victims were the Wilson family, 20-year-old Kimberly Ann Wilson, her father Bill, her stepmother Rose, and her younger sister Julia, who was just 17. They were a typical middle-class family living in one of Bellevue's safest neighborhoods, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and murders were the furthest thing from anyone's mind. But Kimberly had recently developed a casual friendship with 2 local teens, Alex Kevin Barani and David Carpenter Anderson. Both boys were known in their social circles as brooding outcasts. They belonged to a goth group that met regularly at a local Denny's, a group that dabbled in role-playing games with often dark, violent themes. But Barani and Anderson took it much further, often speaking casually about killing, as if it were a fantasy they might one day try to fulfill. On January 3rd, Barani lured Kimberly to Woodbridge Water Tower Park in Bellevue under false pretenses. What happened next was later reconstructed through his confession. There, in the cold and quiet of the park, Barani strangled Kimberly to death with a cord. There was no heated argument, no emotional trigger. It was calculated, cold, premeditated. But he didn't stop there. Fearing Kimberly might have told her family where she was going, Barani made a horrifying decision. He would eliminate anyone who could contact him through the crime. Later that night, he walked to the Wilson family home, armed with a baseball bat and a combat knife. He first entered the master bedroom, attacking Rose Wilson in her sleep. As she struggled, her husband Bill came to her defense, only to be beaten and stabbed to death as well. After finishing off Rose with a knife, Barani climbed the stairs and found Julia. She fought desperately. Her arm was broken in the struggle, but she too was stabbed repeatedly. Before leaving the house, Barani stole several items: a phone, a CD player, and a VCR. Whether as trophies or afterthoughts, the theft would later prove crucial in linking him to the murders. The next day, concerned relatives arrived at the house after no one had answered phone calls. Cars were still in the driveway, lights were on, but no one came to the door. Detective Jeff Gromes responded to the welfare check and found the sliding glass door slightly ajar. Inside, he walked into one of the most brutal crime scenes the Bellevue Police Department had ever encountered. At first, both Barani and Anderson claimed they'd all been together that night playing video games, but their alibi quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted their timeline, and investigators found physical evidence, including bloodied shoes with tread patterns that matched those at the crime scene. Just 5 days after speaking with detectives, Barani confessed. When asked why he did it, his response was chilling. He said he was, quote,
in a rut,
and wanted to experience something, quote,
truly phenomenal.
Anderson initially denied involvement, but DNA evidence and witness accounts eventually placed him at the scene. Both teens were charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and tried as adults. They were each sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, but the case didn't end there. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. As a result, both men were resentenced. In 2022, Anderson received a new sentence, life, with the possibility of parole after 33 years. In 2024, Barani was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 46 years. The Bellevue murders shattered the illusion of safety in one of Washington's wealthiest suburbs. They remain a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the teenager down the street, bored, detached, and willing to kill just to see what it feels like.
An exciting new ride for you to check out on your next visit to Fun Zone at Magic Mountain. Let's go. Big Dipper is a spring ride that is 35 feet tall. Not only do you get to experience that free fall feeling, the ride also rotates a full 360 degrees, giving you a great view of Magic Mountain and the City of Monkey skyline. Check out magicmountain.ca for all of our hours, pricing, and ride restrictions.
Crystal Palace. No, it's Crystal Palace that's closed. Off you go.
In the early hours of August 31st, 1961, in a quiet neighborhood of Tacoma, Washington, 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr vanished from her home without a trace. She was the oldest of 4 children in a well-respected Catholic family, a bright third grader who loved horseback riding, piano lessons, and taking care of her younger siblings. Her disappearance would become one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking cold cases in Washington history. And decades later, some would suspect that it may have been the first known crime committed by Ted Bundy. The Burr family lived in a modest home on North 14th Street. That night, Anne-Marie had gone to bed as usual, but around midnight she got up to comfort her 3-year-old sister Mary, who was crying from a recent arm injury. Her mother, Beverly Burr, tended to Mary and then helped Anne-Marie back to bed. Everything seemed normal, but by 5:30 a.m., Beverly awoke to a terrible silence. She noticed the front door was wide open. Anne-Marie was gone. The only clues were a slight scuff mark on the living room bench and an open window in the basement. A window too small for any adult to enter comfortably, but possibly large enough for a small person to slip through. Within hours, a massive search was underway. Police combed through the neighborhood, and the National Guard and hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Authorities even drained a nearby section of the Puyallup River, desperate to find any sign of the missing child. Nothing turned up. The only potential evidence was a set of faint footprints leading away from the home, believed to belong to a child and possibly an adult, but no physical evidence could be linked to a suspect. At the time, police pursued several leads, including a local man with a history of mental illness and a teenager who reportedly had an obsession with young girls, but both were eventually ruled out. Despite intense public interest and national media attention, the case quickly went cold. Years later, a disturbing theory began to emerge. In 1961, a 14-year-old boy named Theodore Robert Bundy was living just a few miles away in Tacoma. He delivered newspapers in the Burrs neighborhood. Bundy would later become one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, convicted of murdering at least 30 women in the 1970s, though he claimed his actual number of victims was much higher. During Bundy's confessions on death row, he never admitted to Anne-Marie, but he reportedly told a prison psychologist that his, quote, first murder was committed in the early 1960s when he was a teenager. He even described how he left the victim's body in a construction site that was later covered with concrete. In 1961, a construction site existed just 3 blocks from the Burr home. Anne-Marie's parents, Donald and Beverly Burr, believed Ted Bundy may have been involved. In 1987, Beverly wrote him a letter while he was on death row, pleading for answers. Bundy wrote back, denying any involvement, but offering vague and unsolicited theories about how the abduction might have occurred. He even said he could, quote, empathize with the kidnapper, referring to the crime as terrible, but understandable to anyone who once had the impulse to do such a thing. In 2011, Anne-Marie's DNA was compared to unidentified remains found in Florida that some believed may have belonged to one of Bundy's earlier victims, but the results were inconclusive. To this day, no one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. Her body has never been found. Her name isn't on the list of confirmed Bundy sightings, but her case remains one of the most compelling mysteries in the long shadow cast by his crimes. On February 23, 1980, 30-year-old Dorothy Dottie Silzel wrapped up her shift at Gaetano's Pizza in Kent, Washington, and headed home to her East Hill condo. It was a typical Saturday night for the Boeing instructor who balanced 2 jobs to support herself. But 3 days later, when she didn't show up for work at Boeing, concerned coworkers called police for a welfare check. What officers found inside her home would launch one of the longest-running cold cases in Washington state history. Dottie was originally from Mandan, North Dakota, where she graduated high school and worked for the local school district before moving west to the Seattle area. She eventually settled in Kent, Washington. Known for her tireless work ethic, she served full-time as a training supervisor at Boeing in Renton and spent weekends waitressing at Gaetano's Pizza. But she wasn't just hardworking, she was generous with her time, volunteering each year for the Special Olympics, and was beloved by her large family. Her recent purchase of a condo symbolized the independence and stability she'd worked so hard to achieve. On February 26th, Kent Patrol Officer Bob Burwell arrived to perform the welfare check. What he discovered would stay with him for the rest of his life. Dottie had been murdered inside her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and had been strangled to death, killed by cervical compression. The scene was disturbing. There were no signs of forced entry, indicating she may have known her attacker or been tricked to letting him in. The medical examiner confirmed that Dottie had also been assaulted, adding to the brutality of the crime. Detectives combed through the condo, collecting and preserving evidence, including DNA samples that would become crucial years later. At the time, though, DNA analysis was limited. The Washington State Patrol Crimes Lab could only confirm the genetic material belonging to an unidentified man labeled Individual A. Despite dedicated efforts from multiple detectives over the years, no match was ever found. Dozens of DNA profiles were tested, but to no avail. The case remained cold until 2015, when Dottie's family reached out to Sergeant Tim Ford, head of Kent's Major Crimes Unit. Instead of assigning the file to another detective, Ford took the case on himself, an act of personal commitment that would change the outlook of this case. Over the next 9 years, he relentlessly pursued leads, driven by a promise to Dottie's family. In 2022, a breakthrough came. Senior forensic genealogist Misty Gillis used new technology to identify 11 possible relatives linked to Individual A's DNA. 2 of those relatives were brothers Kurt and Kenneth Kundert, living in Arkansas. Kurt willingly provided a DNA sample and was quickly ruled out. Kenneth, however, refused, raising immediate red flags. Investigators learned that in 1980, Kenneth had lived with Kurt in an apartment complex just 1,200 feet away from Dottie's condo. He'd also worked in Snohomish County in the late 1980s, placing him firmly in Washington during the time frame of the murder. In March 2024, Sergeant Ford and his team traveled to Clinton, Arkansas to conduct surveillance on Kenneth. They recovered a discarded cigarette butt, and the DNA on it was a match for individual A. On August 20th, 2024, authorities arrested 65-year-old Kenneth Kundert for the murder of Dorothy Silzel. After evading justice for 44 years, he was taken into custody, held on $3 million bail, and is now awaiting extradition to Washington. For Dottie's family, the arrest was both relieving and bittersweet. Her parents had passed away without seeing justice, but her siblings finally had the answers they'd waited decades for. As her brother Kenny put it,
"We were so blessed to have her in our life."
Sergeant Ford, who retired shortly after the arrest, had fulfilled the promise he made, and after 44 years, Dottie Silzel's story could finally have an ending, one where her killer is no longer free.
I was ambitious when I bought this purple, but my goodness.
These are in the style Isabel. This isn't anything like I normally get, but honestly, I really love them. I like...
Her killer is no longer free. On August 14th, 1986, 14-year-old Jeremy Bright vanished without a trace from the Coos County Fair in Myrtle Point, Oregon, a bustling summer celebration that turned into the backdrop of one of the most haunting missing person cases in the state's history. Jeremy had traveled from Grants Pass to visit his stepfather and attend the fair with his 10-year-old sister. It was supposed to be a carefree day in a familiar town where he'd grown up before moving away. The siblings planned to split up and meet at the Ferris wheel at 5 p.m. Jeremy never showed up. That afternoon, around 4:45 p.m., Jeremy made a long-distance call to his mother, Diane, who was back in Grants Pass. She later recalled that nothing in his voice hinted at distress or danger. It was the last confirmed contact anyone had with him. His sister waited at the Ferris wheel, growing increasingly anxious. Jeremy had always been protective, responsible, and close with his sister. He wouldn't have broken their plans without a word. As the sun set and the fair lights flickered on, the nightmare began to take shape. Jeremy stood out, 6 feet tall, 140 pounds, with brown hair, green eyes, and a broken index finger wrapped in a splint. He had scars on his forehead and nose, a mole on his chin. That day, he wore a black windbreaker, red tank top, blue nylon shorts, and black Nike sneakers with red laces. Initially, police treated the case as a teenage runaway situation. They suggested he'd gone off with friends or skipped town on a whim. But Jeremy had no history of that kind of behavior, and his personal belongings, including his wallet and watch, were left behind. A crucial 24 hours passed before the case was treated as a serious disappearance, and then came the rumors. Some claimed Jeremy had been at a party and unknowingly consumed a beer laced with drugs, overdosing in front of other teams who panicked and hid his body. Others whispered about a tragic accident during a swim in the Coquille River, where Jeremy had allegedly been shot during reckless target practice and later buried in the woods by those involved. Amid the speculation, one name kept surfacing: Terry Lee Steinhoff, Jeremy's former babysitter. Several witnesses reported seeing Jeremy in Steinhoff's truck on the day he vanished. When questioned by police, Steinhoff gave evasive answers and refused to cooperate further. 2 years later, in 1988, Steinhoff was arrested for the brutal stabbing of 32-year-old Patricia Morris. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities tried multiple times to get him to talk about Jeremy. He never did. In 2007, Steinhoff died in prison from a drug overdose, taking whatever he knew with him. Despite numerous tips and search efforts over the years, including a 2016 dive into a remote pond 25 miles from Myrtle Point, Jeremy's body has never been found. In 2011, on the 25th anniversary of his disappearance, Jeremy's family held a memorial service. They publicly acknowledged the likelihood that he was dead, but pleaded for answers.
We just want to bring him home.
The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989, giving it national exposure, but no major leads ever emerged. Police now believe Jeremy was abducted and murdered, and that his remains are hidden somewhere in the rugged terrain of Coos County, an unforgiving wilderness that can swallow secrets for decades. Today, Jeremy Bright would be 52 years old. His story remains a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a child can vanish, and how, even after nearly 40 years, justice can still feel just out of reach. The Pacific Northwest keeps its secrets well. A boy disappears into a crowd, a scream echoes through the trees, a name fades from headlines, but not from memory. Time moves on, but the weight of the unknown remains. Not loud, just there, like someone watching from the tree line. And in towns wrapped in fog and forest, people still wonder what really happened. Because some stories don't end, they just wait.
Muted.
You're watching Northern Crimes.
January 11th, 1979, Bellingham, Washington. The green Mercury Bobcat cuts through the darkness, headlights slicing across empty streets. Inside, two college students chat nervously about easy money, $100 each for just 2 hours of house sitting. Karen Mandick nervously grips the wheel. Beside her, Diane Wilder checks the address again, 334 Bayside Road, an isolated mansion overlooking Chucknut Bay. They pull into the driveway. A Watcom security pickup is already waiting. He approaches with a smile, uniform lending him authority, security guard, trustworthy, normal, the kind of person you'd never suspect.
Thanks for coming.
His voice is calm and reassuring.
This should be quick.
The house looms dark against the night sky. No neighbors, no witnesses. Perfect isolation. Karen and Diane follow him toward the front door, thinking about rent money, tuition payments, their bright futures ahead. They have no idea they're walking into a trap. The door opens. They step inside. Behind them, it closes with a sound like a coffin sealing shut. What follows will expose a crime far larger than it first appears, because this isn't just about two young women in Washington. This is about a predator whose reach already extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest. And to understand what unfolds here, we need to step back to a decade of upheaval, a period when America was changing rapidly, and a new kind of predator was emerging. This is Northern Crimes.
So thick. How did I used to do this? Yeah, fucker. Was it with you? I think so. Let's try it this way.
The 1970s marked a period of transition in the United States. The Vietnam War was winding down. Watergate had eroded trust in the government. A generation that came of age promising reform and openness was now confronting economic uncertainty, social fragmentation, and a rising sense of unease. But something truly dark was stirring beneath the surface. By the mid-70s, violent crime was exploding across the nation. Murder rates had roughly doubled since 1960. Cities that once felt safe were becoming hunting grounds, and a new term was entering the American vocabulary: serial killer. The phrase itself was coined by FBI profiler Robert Ressler in 1974, but the phenomenon was already taking hold across the country. Ted Bundy was stalking college campuses in the Pacific Northwest. John Wayne Gacy was burying bodies beneath his Chicago home. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was turning New York into a city of fear. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, methodical, and seemingly random. The killers looked like everyone else: charming, intelligent, normal. They could be your neighbor, your coworker, your friend. And nowhere was this new breed of predator more active than California. The Golden State had become a magnet for drifters, runaways, and those seeking to reinvent themselves. The permissive culture of the 60s had given way to something darker in the 70s. Hitchhiking was common. Trust was abundant. Vulnerability was everywhere. It was the perfect hunting ground. In Los Angeles, a violent pattern was beginning to take shape. The streets were crowded with runaways, sex workers, and young women chasing opportunity, many without safety nets. For some, Hollywood offered far less than it promised. Police resources were limited. Disappearances were routine. When deaths began surfacing across the city, the cases were handled individually. By 1977, that all changed. Young women were vanishing from the streets of Hollywood and later found dead in the hills above LA. The cause of death was consistent: brutal assault followed by strangulation, leaving little doubt that the cases were connected. The media dubbed the unknown killer, quote, the Hillside Strangler. At the time, investigators believed they were searching for a single offender. The first body was discovered on October 17, 1977. 19-year-old Yolanda Washington was found on a hillside near the Ventura Freeway. Investigators noted signs that her body had been cleaned before it was left behind. Additional cases followed. Over the next several months, young women disappeared from the streets of LA and were later found dead on remote hillsides. The cause of death was consistent. The locations were deliberate. A pattern was emerging. As investigators and the media concentrated on LA, few realized it was only part of a much larger story.
At Source for Sports, we don't just fit teams, we fit towns. We run with the towns that don't mind getting a little snow in their shoes, and make jerseys for towns that wear them with pride. Because there was a time when we wore them too. We fit the towns that celebrate big moments as much as they do the little ones. Why? Because we're from these towns.
New matcha foam cleanse whisks away impurities. Infused with Japanese ceremonial grade matcha, our gel to ultrafine foam cleanser.
It was only part of a much larger story. The second victim appeared 2 weeks later. 15-year-old Judith Lynn Miller was a student at Hollywood High School who also worked as a prostitute to survive on the streets. On October 31st, 1977, she was looking for clients along Sunset Boulevard when she encountered two men who seemed different from her usual customers. Her body was discovered the next morning in La Crescenta, dumped in a middle-class residential area. She'd been bound and strangled. The killer wanted her to be found. The violence continued. 21-year-old Lisa Caston was a dancer and waitress working in North Hollywood. Unlike the previous victims, she wasn't involved in prostitution. She was simply a young woman trying to make it in LA. On November 5th, her coworkers noticed her talking to two men who acted strangely. The next day, her body was found near a country club in Glendale. The pattern was becoming clear. The worst was yet to come. On November 13th, two schoolgirls stepped off a bus at Eagle Rock Plaza. 12-year-old Dolores Dolly Cepeda and 14-year-old Sonia Johnson were best friends, innocent children with their whole lives ahead of them. Two men approached them, flashing what appeared to be police badges. The girls trusted the fake officers and then got into their car. A week later, their bodies were found in a garbage pile in Highland Park. Both had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The killers had crossed a line. They were now targeting children. In the meantime, Los Angeles was gripped by anxiety. Daily routines began to change. Women avoided going out alone at night. Some purchased firearms for protection. Parents became more cautious about letting their kids travel unaccompanied. But the killers seemed to feed on the terror they were causing. 20-year-old Kristen Weckler was an honors student at Art Center College of Design. She had dreams of becoming a successful artist. On November 20th, her body was found on a hillside near her Glendale residence. The autopsy revealed she'd been tortured with cleaning fluid injected into her body before being asphyxiated with gas from an oven. The level of sadism was escalating. 18-year-old Lauren Ray Wagner was a business school student with a bright future. Her body was discovered on November 29th with burn marks on her hands from electrical torture. Evidence suggested she'd been handcuffed before being strangled. By now, investigators realized they were dealing with someone who might be impersonating a police officer. The final victim of 1977 was 17-year-old Kimberly Diane Martin. She worked for an escort service and was called to a Hollywood address on December 13th. Her body was found the next day in the Silver Lake neighborhood, dumped in a deserted lot where it could be seen from the LAPD's Parker Center headquarters, a deliberate taunt to law enforcement. But the killings didn't stop with 1977. On February 16, 1978, 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth became the final LA victim. The waitress was sexually assaulted, strangled, and dumped in the trunk of her own car before being pushed off a cliff on Angeles Crest Highway. As early 1978 progressed, Los Angeles remained a city under siege. 11 young women were dead, families were shattered, a community lived in fear. The Hillside Strangler had claimed victim after victim with seeming impunity. But what investigators didn't know was that the killing spree was about to pause. One of the killers was preparing to leave LA, carrying his deadly skills to a quiet college town in Washington state. The terror was headed to the Pacific Northwest. Kenneth Bianchi was born on May 22, 1951, in Rochester, New York. The son of a 17-year-old prostitute struggling with alcoholism, he was given up for adoption 2 weeks later. That August, Nicholas and Frances Bianchi took him in, believing they were offering a child a stable future. From an early age, Kenneth exhibited behavior that concerned his adoptive parents. Frances Bianchi later described him as a habitual liar, even as a small child. He experienced episodes in which he appeared to lose awareness, and doctors diagnosed him with absence seizures by age 5. As he grew older, additional issues emerged. Kenneth struggled with chronic bedwetting and sudden, intense temper tantrums. Despite testing above average in intelligence, he performed poorly in school, frustrating teachers who believed he was capable of more. The death of his adoptive father, Nicholas, in 1965 revealed something disturbing about the 14-year-old boy. While most kids would grieve the loss of a parent, Kenneth showed no emotion whatsoever. No tears, no sadness, just an eerie indifference that, quite frankly, creeped people out. As Kenneth entered his teenage years, his behavior became increasingly concerning. He was caught pulling down a girl's underwear. His academic performance continued to decline despite his intelligence. After graduating from Gates Chili High School in 1970, Kenneth married his girlfriend, Brenda Beck. The marriage lasted just 8 months before she left, and Kenneth grew more isolated in the aftermath. Determined to find a career that would give him power and control, Kenneth set his sights on law enforcement. He enrolled at Monroe Community College to study police science, but dropped out after just one semester. His application to the Monroe County Sheriff's Department was rejected. Unable to become a legitimate police officer, Kenneth found work as a private security guard. The position gave him access to valuable items, which he frequently stole and gave to girlfriends and prostitutes. His pattern of theft forced him to change jobs regularly. In 1976, Kenneth had grown tired of his failures in New York. At 25, he left for LA to live with his adoptive cousin, Angelo Buono Jr. Angelo was everything Kenneth wanted to be. At 42, he was confident, successful with women, and commanded respect through intimidation. He owned an upholstery shop in Glendale and had a documented history of sexual violence. Under Angelo's influence, Kenneth was introduced to California's permissive culture, where sex and drugs were freely available. Kenneth found work at California Land Title Company and used his first paycheck to rent an apartment.
So cute. Over live streaming right now.
Paycheck to rent an apartment in Glendale, but he still harbored dreams of becoming a police officer. When both the LAPD and Glendale Police Department rejected his applications, Kenneth's resentment deepened. At the title company, he began dating co-worker Kelly Boyd. When she became pregnant in June 1977, Kenneth proposed, but Kelly declined, sensing something wasn't right. As Kelly's pregnancy progressed, Kenneth's behavior became more erratic. He'd disappear for entire nights with Angelo, refusing to explain their activities. What Kelly didn't know was that Kenneth and Angelo had begun working as pimps, exploiting vulnerable women. But for two men who craved ultimate power and control, well, prostitution was just the beginning. On February 23, 1978, Kelly gave birth to a son named Ryan at Glendale Adventist Hospital. The arrival of his child should have been transformative for Kenneth, but instead seemed to accelerate his descent into darkness. Exhausted by Kenneth's lies and frightened by his behavior, Kelly decided to return to her parents' home in Bellingham, Washington. Kenneth begged for reconciliation, promising that he'd change. Against her better judgment, Kelly agreed to give him one more chance, but only if he moved to Bellingham with her. So in late May 1978, Kenneth reluctantly left LA. But the damage was already done. Between October 1977 and February 1978, the two cousins had embarked on a killing spree that terrorized Los Angeles. Now, Kenneth was carrying those deadly skills north to a quiet college town that had no idea what was coming.
You've seen these villains before. Same problems, different forms. In Ace of Uptime, you put your IT know-how to the test to conquer these agents of chaos. Can you defeat the villains caused
skills north to a quiet college town that had no idea what was coming? Bellingham, Washington in 1978 bore little resemblance to Los Angeles. It was a small college town, quiet and predictable, where violent crime felt distant and unlikely. Kenneth Bianchi rented a house at 401 East North Street and found work as a security guard with Whatcom Security Agency. He was reunited with Kelly and their infant son, and to those around him, he appeared to be settling into a stable routine. That impression was reinforced in August when he took a security position at the Fred Meyer Super Shopping Center at 800 Lakeway Drive. The job brought him into daily contact with employees and customers, including students from Western Washington University. One of them was Karen Mandek. Karen was 22 from Bellevue, studying business administration as a junior at WWU and working part-time to support herself through school. Kenneth noticed her quickly, not because she stood out, but because she trusted him. In November, Kenneth was rehired by Whatcom Security and given the title of patrol captain. He began taking police courses and applied to become a reserve deputy for the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department. The uniform, the authority, and the routine gave him cover, but behind it, nothing had changed. Kenneth began paying closer attention to Karen, her schedule, her need for extra income, her willingness to accept help from someone in a position of authority. The opportunity presented itself at 334 Bayside Road. The Catlow residence sat isolated above Chuckanuck Bay, its owners away on vacation. The house belonged to William V. Catlow, a recently retired Georgia Pacific Corporation executive
Oh yeah, I
who was
forgot how we got to
vacationing
this
in
part
Europe
of the
with his
story.
wife, Cleora. It was isolated,
Cleora?
surrounded by trees and far from any neighbors who might hear screams. Kenneth had access to the property through his security work. He knew the owners were away. He understood the layout and the vulnerabilities. It was perfect for what he had in mind. As 1978 turned to 1979, Kenneth began putting his plan into motion. He would approach Karen with what seemed like a legitimate job opportunity, easy money for simple work. He would use his security uniform and professional demeanor to gain her trust. But what Karen didn't know was that she was being stalked by a predator who'd already killed multiple times. The quiet security guard who seemed so helpful and trustworthy was actually one of the most dangerous men in America. Kenneth Bianchi had brought the Hillside Strangler to Bellingham, and Karen Mandic was about to become his final victim. January 11th, 1979, 7 p.m. Karen Mandic left Fred Meyer for an extended dinner break, telling her manager she'd be back around 9. She'd mentioned the house-sitting job to a few coworkers. It was easy money for watching an empty house while the alarm system was repaired. Karen had asked her housemate, Diane Wilder, to come with her. Diane was 27, a transfer student majoring in dance at Western Washington's Fairhaven College, originally from Bremerton. She was older and more cautious, but the pay was unusually high for simple work. Together, they decided it was worth the risk. They followed Kenneth into the house at 334 Bayside Road. The interior was dark and quiet as he turned on lights and walked them through the rooms. Everything appeared routine, but at some point inside the house, that changed. What followed was later reconstructed through physical evidence. Karen and Diane fought back. Investigators documented signs of a struggle and attempts to escape, but the house was isolated and empty. Kenneth controlled both the time and space available to him. In the basement, both women were assaulted and strangled. The method mirrored the pattern used in Los Angeles, but this time, Kenneth acted alone. Afterward, he loaded their bodies into Karen's Mercury Bobcat and drove to Willow Court North, a heavily wooded, undeveloped cul-de-sac off Willow Road, where he abandoned the car. He then returned to his routine, home, work, training, showing no outward sign of what had occurred. But Kenneth had made mistakes, critical errors that would unravel everything he'd worked to build in Bellingham. The careful predator who'd evaded capture in LA was about to discover that his luck had finally run out. The trap he'd set for Karen and Diane was about to become a trap for himself. January 12th, 1979, 4:30 p.m. A woman named Shirley Schlemmer spotted the green Mercury Bobcat parked at the end of Willow Court North. Something about the abandoned car, it troubled her enough to call police. When Bellingham detectives arrived, they made a horrific discovery. 2 bodies were stuffed in the back seat, Karen Mandic and Diane Wilder, both dead from strangulation. The crime scene was processed meticulously. The bodies were carefully removed and transported to St. Luke General Hospital for autopsy. The car was towed to the Bellingham Police Garage for forensic analysis. Dr. Robert P. Gibb conducted the autopsies and confirmed both women had died from ligature strangulation, a deliberate and practiced method. Attention quickly turned to the house-sitting job that had brought Karen and Diane to Bayside Road. When questioned, Kenneth denied involvement, and he offered shifting explanations for his whereabouts that night. He claimed he'd been at a Whatcom County Sheriff's Office Reserve Unit meeting, but when police checked, they learned he'd asked to be excused. Those accounts unraveled almost immediately. Investigators also recovered multiple pieces of evidence linking Kenneth to the crime. A handwritten note in Diane's writing indicating Ken Bianchi had called on January 9th. A piece of paper in Karen's car with, quote, 334 Bayside, 7 p.m. Ken, unquote, written on it. Carpet fibers from the Catlow residence that matched those found on the victim's clothing, and a witness who placed a Whatcom security truck in the area that night.
It looks a little bit crazy, that's fine. Oh my god, these are so cute.
Okay, I'll keep there.
Wait, I love these. Wait, okay. Yep. First try.
Don't care.
A witness who placed a Whatcom security truck in the area that night. The investigation took a decisive turn when Detective Fred Nolte contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. The call reached Detective Sergeant Frank Salerno of the Hillside Strangler Task Force, who immediately recognized the connection when he heard Kenneth's address. Within days, LA investigators were up in Bellingham. A search of Kenneth's home uncovered stolen property and jewelry matching items taken from Hillside Strangler victims. FBI lab analysis confirmed the physical links between Kenneth, the Bellingham crime scene, and the victims. On January 15, 1979, Kenneth appeared in court on possession charges, but on January 26th, he was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he initially attempted an insanity defense, claiming multiple personality disorder, but psychiatrists quickly determined that he was faking the condition. With his options exhausted, Kenneth accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he would plead guilty to the Bellingham murders and testify against his cousin, Angelo Bono, in the LA cases. On October 19, 1979, Kenneth withdrew his insanity plea and then pleaded guilty to both murder charges. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Within 30 minutes of that plea, Angelo Bono was arrested in Los Angeles. The case was closed through careful police work and coordination between agencies, ending the killings not through chance, but through persistence and attention to detail.
No, that sounds like chance.
The quiet college town of Bellingham had been forever changed by a predator who brought big city violence to their community. But in the end, it was methodical investigation and interagency cooperation that brought him down. The nightmare was finally over. Kenneth Bianchi was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remains today. In July 1990, the State Parole Board set his minimum sentence at 116.5 years. He won't be eligible for parole until 2059. Angelo Bono's trial became the longest criminal trial in American history, lasting over 2 years. Despite Kenneth's inconsistent and often obstructive testimony, Bono was convicted of 9 murders in November 1983. He died from a massive heart attack in his cell at Calipatria State Penitentiary in September 2002. The Hillside Strangler investigation reshaped how law enforcement approaches serial crime. It exposed the risks of fragmented investigations and underscored the necessity of information sharing across jurisdictions, lessons that would later influence major cases in the decades that followed. For the families of the victims, the legal outcome offered limited resolution. 12 young women were gone. Daughters, sisters, friends, students. Lives ended long before they had a chance to unfold. Yolanda Washington, Judith Miller, Melissa Caston, Jane King, Dolores Cepeda, Sonia Johnson, Christina Weckler, Lauren Wagner, Kimberly Martin, Cindy Hudspeth, Karen Mandick, Diane Wilder. Today, Bellingham moves through its routines. Western Washington University continues to grow. The Catlow House still overlooks Chuckanut Bay, but the events in 1979 remain part of the city's record, evidence that violence doesn't always announce itself.
Where is my twine? Oh. I don't want to work on anything else right now. I want to finish these. Might be upstairs in the craft room. There's nobody on the live stream, so I'll be right back.
You're watching Northern Crimes. You're watching Northern Crimes.
October 24th, Moose Creek, Gallatin County, Montana. You're a 35-year-old contractor setting up your wall tent in the shadow of the Gallatin Range, 35 miles from the nearest town. The October air is crisp and clean, carries the scent of pine and the promise of a peaceful weekend in the wilderness. Your girlfriend will arrive tomorrow. You've done this countless times before. You know these mountains. You respect their dangers and understand how to camp safely in bear country. Your tent is secure, your food properly stored, and you're looking forward to a quiet evening under the stars. That's when you hear someone approaching through the trees. A stranger with a dog looking for a place to camp. Being the type of person you are, welcoming, generous, the type who believes in mountain hospitality, you invite him to share a beer and some conversation around the fire. You pour drinks into shot glasses, crack open a couple of cans, and settle in for what feels like a normal encounter between fellow outdoorsmen. As the night grows darker and the conversation continues, you don't realize you're sharing drinks with a predator whose body is covered in white supremacist tattoos and whose idea of camping involves carrying an axe and a screwdriver. Because in the North Country's remote campgrounds, where help is hours away and screams are swallowed by the wilderness, some strangers aren't looking for solitude.
Oh yeah, this one.
Join the new Michaels Rewards program for free and get 3% back on your purchase. Level up to gold and earn 6% back. And you can go platinum and earn 9% back. The new Michaels Rewards program. Create more.
You're watching Northern Crimes.
Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories, July 9th, 1931. A man arrives into one of the most remote communities on the Canadian frontier. No introduction, no explanation, no name offered beyond the one he gives when pressed, Albert Johnson. Fort McPherson sits deep in the Mackenzie River Delta, a place where the land is so expansive and so indifferent to human presence that most people who arrive here come with some sort of reason. Trappers come for the fur, traders come for the commerce. The RCMP come because someone has to maintain order at the edge of the known world. Albert Johnson, however, came for none of those reasons, or if he did, he never said so. What the people of Fort McPherson noticed immediately was this. The man was secretive in a way that went beyond the natural reserve of a frontier loner. RCMP Constable Edgar Millen questioned him shortly after he arrived and noted a Scandinavian accent. He was clean-shaven. He had plenty of money, significant supplies, considerable cash, and yet he held no trapping license. He offered no explanation for where he'd come from or what he intended to do. In a community where everyone's business was everyone else's business, Johnson's combination of substance and secrecy made him immediately conspicuous. He simply arrived, and then he disappeared into the wilderness to build himself a cabin. The cabin itself told its own story. 8 feet by 10 feet, constructed in the Mackenzie River Delta, small enough to heat efficiently, solid enough to withstand the Arctic winter, and, as events would later reveal, fortified in ways that went far beyond the practical needs of a man simply trying to survive the cold. Albert Johnson was preparing for something. Nobody in Fort McPherson knew that, and nobody would find out until it was far too late. This is Northern Crimes.
I'm gonna use the big one.
December 1931. The temperature across the Northwest Territories had dropped into deep, bitter cold, 40 to 50 below zero. The kind of cold that kills the unprepared within hours. It was in this environment that the first complaints began to surface. Indigenous trappers in the area around the Rat River went to the RCMP with a serious allegation. An outsider had been tampering with their traps, interfering with lines that represented not just income, but survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. When they'd attempted to confront the man responsible, he met them at his cabin with a weapon drawn and a clear message: leave immediately. Well, the RCMP couldn't ignore this. On December 26th, Constables Alfred King and Joe Bernard made the journey to Johnson's cabin to investigate. What they encountered was a man who refused to acknowledge their presence entirely. He covered the window with a sack. He refused to respond to their knocking. He offered nothing, not a word, not a gesture, just silence from behind a fortified door. The constables had no legal grounds to force entry without a warrant, so they left. They came back on December 31st, this time with a search warrant, this time with reinforcements. King approached the door, and Johnson fired through the wooden door without warning. The bullet struck King seriously, wounding him badly enough that the officers were forced to abandon the confrontation and make the 60-mile journey back to Aklavik to seek medical attention. Johnson had just shot a Mountie in 1931. In the Canadian North, this wasn't simply a crime, it was a declaration. The RCMP response was swift and highly coordinated. On January 9th, 1932, a posse of 9 men returned to the Rat River cabin. They brought 20 pounds of dynamite. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confrontations in Canadian law enforcement history. The posse detonated the dynamite against the cabin. The roof collapsed. By any reasonable assessment, the man inside should have been dead, or at minimum, incapacitated and ready to surrender. Instead, from a 5-foot dugout beneath the ruins of his own cabin, in temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius, Albert Johnson continued to fight.
Vistaprint helps bring your ideas to life with easy-to-use design tools, real human support, and all the products you need at prices you can feel good about. Just think it, click it, and print it with Vistaprint. Print your possible with 20% off your first order at Vistaprint.ca.
I'm bored. Let's see what else we can find.
For 15 hours, a single man held off 9 officers from beneath the wreckage of a structure that had just been blown up around him. 15 hours in the Arctic, without shelter, without any apparent intention of giving up. The officers outside were exhausted. They were freezing and running dangerously low on supplies. They'd arrived expecting a quick resolution. What they got instead was a lesson in just how completely they'd underestimated the man inside. When they finally pulled back, it wasn't a tactical retreat. It was literally the only option left. A single man in a hole in the frozen ground had beaten them. And when they returned, Johnson was gone. He'd used that window of their retreat to vanish back into the wilderness. At the time, nobody yet understood what they were dealing with, but they were about to find out.
1930, so it was after the war.
January 30th, 1932. After weeks of relentless pursuit through the Arctic wilderness, a reinforced posse finally caught up to Albert Johnson, cornering him in a dense thicket somewhere along his flight path. The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. Constable Edgar Millen, the same officer who'd first questioned Johnson upon his arrival in Fort McPherson 6 months earlier, was shot through the head. He died at the scene, and then Johnson vanished again. What he did next defied rational explanation. Pursued by a growing posse across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet, Albert Johnson climbed into the Richardson Mountains in the middle of a blizzard, in temperatures that had dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius. He scaled a peak reaching 7,000 feet and crossed into the Yukon Territory. This was considered by the men pursuing him and by every wilderness expert consulted at the time to be essentially impossible. The Richardson Mountains, in those conditions, they weren't a barrier that human beings crossed on foot. They were a place where people died. When the posse realized what Johnson had done, they couldn't believe it. They were experienced men who knew this country very well, and every one of them understood that what Johnson had just accomplished should have been a death sentence, but it wasn't. Somehow, he'd survived. The manhunt had now stretched across 2 territories and captured the attention of the entire country. Newspapers across Canada and internationally ran the story. Here was a lone man, identity unknown, outrunning and outfighting one of the most respected law enforcement agencies in the world across the frozen top of the continent. The RCMP responded with two decisions that would mark this case as a turning point in Canadian law enforcement history. First, the pursuit was being broadcast in real time via radio to a captivated public. This was the first major Canadian manhunt to use radio broadcasts for live media coverage. The entire country was captivated. Second, the RCMP hired Wilfred May, known universally as Wap May, a World War I flying ace, to track Johnson from the air in a Blanca monoplane. This was the first time aerial surveillance had ever been deployed in a major Canadian manhunt. Two historic firsts, both born from the desperation of trying to catch one man. On February 14th, May made a discovery from the air that revealed the full measure of Johnson's tactical intelligence. Johnson wasn't simply running, he was scheming. He'd been following caribou tracks along the middle of frozen rivers, using the compacted snow for speed while simultaneously concealing his own footprints within the herd's trail. He traveled in the open only during daylight hours, camping on the riverbanks at night where the tree line provided cover from aerial observation. May had been flying search patterns for days before he pieced it together. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't luck. Johnson had constructed a deliberate system of movement designed to defeat both ground pursuit and aerial observation simultaneously. A man, alone in the Arctic, with no maps and no support, had been outthinking a coordinated multi-agency operation at every single turn. The posse following Johnson on the ground numbered more than 40 men at its peak. They had dogs, supplies, weapons, and the full resources of the RCMP behind them. Johnson was simply carrying a pack on his back. He'd been evading them for weeks.
Aussie Ultra Wonder Gel Cream combines moisture and hold for juicy defined curls in just one step.
So far, the manhunt had covered 150 miles of Arctic wilderness. The temperature hadn't risen above minus 40 degrees for most of that distance. Johnson's caloric output during this period was later estimated at approximately 10,000 calories per day. The physical demands of what he was doing were, by any scientific measure, at the absolute outer limit of human endurance, and yet he still ran. February 17th, 1932, Eagle River, Yukon Territory. Wap May had been tracking Johnson's movement patterns from the air, relaying his position to the pursuit team on the ground. For the first time in weeks, the posse had a closing window. They rounded a bend in the river, and there he was. Johnson was only a few hundred yards ahead, moving along the open ice. Without his snowshoes, he couldn't reach the riverbank and the cover of the tree line before the posse closed the distance. He was pinned in the middle of the open river with no cover available in any direction. For the first time in 49 days, Albert Johnson had nowhere to go. Consider what that moment must have felt like for the men closing in on him. 49 days, one dead colleague, two seriously wounded, hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness covered in temperatures that defied human endurance. And now, finally, a few hundred yards of open ice standing between them and the man who'd put them through hell. But there was no celebration in that moment, just the grim, focused momentum of men who'd been waiting a very long time for this. And what followed was a frenzy of gunfire. Sergeant Hersey was wounded during the exchange. Johnson fought back with the same ferocious precision he demonstrated throughout the entire pursuit. But the numbers were impossible. The open ground offered nothing to work with. The shot that ended it entered Johnson's left pelvis at an acute angle, severing vital tissues and arteries. The shot was credited to Special Constable John Moses. Johnson went down on the ice and didn't get up. When the officers reached the body, what they found was a man who'd been pushed to the absolute edge of human physical endurance and had kept going anyway. He was totally emaciated. The weeks of Arctic flight had stripped everything from him, and yet, according to the accounts of the officers present, there was something on his face in death that stopped them cold. A grimace, the kind that suggested he was laughing at them when he died. For men who'd just spent 49 days being outrun, outfought, and outthought by a single individual, that expression carried a particular sting. They'd caught him all right, and they'd killed him. And standing over his body on the frozen Eagle River, with the wind cutting across the Yukon around them, at least some of those men must have felt that even in his final moment, Albert Johnston had somehow held something back. Something he was taking with him to the grave. Whether that grimace was involuntary as a result of the physical trauma of his final moments, or something else entirely. The men who'd spent weeks chasing this man across the frozen north reported the same thing. Even in death, Albert Johnston seemed to be one step ahead of them. Well, the manhunt was over. 49 days, 150 miles, one dead Mountie, 2 seriously wounded officers, and a man lying on the ice of the Eagle River whose name, history, and whose reasons for any of it remained completely unknown. The pursuit had ended, but the mystery had just begun. The examination of Albert Johnston's remains and belongings produced a portrait full of contradictions. He was carrying over $2,000 in American and Canadian currency, along with some gold. In 1932, this was a significant sum, enough to suggest a man of means, or at minimum, a man who'd accumulated resources deliberately before disappearing into the north. His weapons were specific and well chosen: a .22 LR Winchester Model 58, a .30-30 Savage Model 99F, a sawed-off 16-gauge Iver Johnson shotgun. These were not the weapons of someone who'd grabbed what was just available. These were choices of someone who understood firearms and had made deliberate choices about what to carry. His personal effects told a stranger story: a pocket compass, a razor, a knife, fishhooks and nails, Beecham's pills, and 2 dead animals, a squirrel and a bird, presumably intended as food. These were the possessions of a man stripped down to pure survival. Every item functional, nothing personal, nothing that pointed anywhere. But it was his dental work that stopped investigators in their tracks. Albert Johnston's teeth contained exceptionally high-quality gold fillings and bridges, the kind of dental work that in 1932 would have required access to a skilled dentist in a major metropolitan center: Chicago, New York, somewhere with the infrastructure to support that level of craftsmanship. Somewhere with the infrastructure to support that level of craftsmanship. This wasn't the mouth of a frontier drifter. This was the mouth of a man who'd at some point in his life lived somewhere very different from the Rat River Delta. And that contradiction sat at the heart of everything: the money, the dental work, quality of his weapons. Every piece of physical evidence pointed toward a man with a history, a real one, a documented one, a life lived somewhere with addresses and records and people who would have known his name. Yet he'd seemingly walked away from all of it so deliberately and so completely that not one single thread remained to pull. Forensic analysis also revealed that Johnston had scoliosis, an asymmetrical tailbone, and 1 foot longer than the other.
Jeez.
These conditions would have caused him chronic back pain and given him a distinct and recognizable gait. The man who just outrun 40 officers across 150 miles of wilderness had been doing so in chronic pain, with a body that was structurally compromised from the start. So the investigators had a body. They had evidence. They had physical characteristics detailed enough to identify almost anyone. Yet, they still had no idea who he was. Over the decades that followed, numerous suspects were proposed and investigated. John Johnson, a North Dakota criminal, was considered a strong candidate for years. DNA testing in 1989 and again in 2007 ruled him out. Sigvald Petersen Hochschild, a Norwegian draft evader, was investigated and also eliminated. Owen Albert Johnston, connected to a Nova Scotia family, was tested and cleared. Every lead dissolved, every promising match fell apart under scientific scrutiny. Then, in 2007, forensic scientists applied isotope analysis to Johnson's teeth. The oxygen molecules preserved in the dental enamel pointed toward a specific geographic origin, Scandinavia, or the American Midwest, specifically the Corn Belt region of the U.S. The analysis concluded that Johnson was likely an American who lived most of his life in the U.S. before moving to Canada approximately 7 months before his death. He hadn't come from the wilderness. He'd come from somewhere ordinary, somewhere with dentists and cities and the kind of life that leaves traces. And then he'd erased every one of those traces so completely that nearly a century of investigation couldn't reconstruct them. In 2021, the forensic genetics company Othram Incorporated successfully sequenced Johnson's DNA. The results were the most specific the case had ever produced. Johnson's ancestry traced back to Sweden. Genetic matches connected him to descendants of Gustav Magnusson, born 1776, and Britta Svensdotter, born 1781, from the Swedish towns of Hunger, Chevshire, and Kultorp. For the first time in 90 years, investigators had a geographic origin, a family line, a thread connecting the man on the Eagle River ice to a very specific corner of the world. But the family line isn't a name, and a geographic origin, it's not an identity. And this is the part that is so genuinely difficult to absorb. I mean, we live in an era now where anonymity is almost impossible to maintain, where digital records, genetic databases, and forensic technology can reconstruct a life from the smallest biological trace. And yet, here is a man who died in 1932, whose DNA has now been sequenced by one of the most advanced forensic genetic companies in the world, and we still can't tell you his name with absolute certainty. Whatever Albert Johnson did to erase himself, he did it well enough to defeat tools that didn't even exist when he was alive. The DNA tells us where his ancestors came from, but it doesn't tell us who he was, what he'd done, or why he chose to vanish so completely into the Canadian North that he was willing to die rather than be identified. That question, the only question that has ever really mattered in this case, remains unanswered. Think about what that means. A man arrived in Fort McPherson in the summer of 1931 carrying significant money, high-quality dental work, and a set of survival skills that bordered on superhuman. He built a fortified cabin. He shot a Mountie. He survived a dynamite blast in minus 40-degree temperatures. He crossed a mountain range in a blizzard that should have killed him. He evaded 40 men in the first aerial manhunt in Canadian history for 49 days across 150 miles of Arctic wilderness. And he did all of it without ever saying a single word to his pursuers. Not one word, not a name, not an explanation, not a plea, nothing. The only person ever confirmed to have heard Albert Johnson speak was Constable Edgar Millen, who noted his Scandinavian accent during the brief initial interview in Fort McPherson. Millen was later killed by the man he'd spoken to. Whatever Johnson said in that conversation, whatever impression he made, Millen took it with him onto the ice at Rat River. The ghost of Rat River has been dead now for over 90 years. He's been examined, tested, analyzed, and investigated by some of the most sophisticated forensic science ever applied to a historical case, and yet the mystery remains. Some people disappear into the wilderness by accident. Some disappear by misfortune. Albert Johnson disappeared by design. He chose his anonymity the way other men choose their weapons. Deliberately, carefully, with the full understanding of what it would cost him. The cost, in the end, was everything. The only question now is whether the mystery of the mad trapper of Rat River will ever truly be solved.
Real Strength isn't hiding from migraines. Get new Advil migraine and headache liquid gels. Advil, that's Real Strength.
As a business leader, you know family matters to your employees, even the four-legged kind. When companies offer pet insurance, HR professionals report that 84% of employees feel better about their jobs. That's because healthier pets make for happier employees. New to Canada, One Pack Plan helps make it easy to offer pet insurance as an employee benefit. Flat group rates, seamless payroll integration, and coverage for pre-existing conditions. Look after who they love, and they'll love working for you.
You're watching Northern Crimes.
July 21st, 1982. North Bay Psychiatric Hospital, Ontario. You're 18 years old, and after 46 days as a patient, you've finally earned limited privileges to walk the hospital grounds unsupervised. It's 10 a.m., and the summer air feels good against your face as you step outside the imposing brick buildings that have been your world for the past month and a half. The massive complex stretches across the landscape like a small city, connected by underground tunnels and surrounded by deep forests. Highway 11 runs past the facility, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Ontario wilderness. You have 1 hour, 60 minutes of freedom to walk wherever you want on the grounds, to feel normal again, to remember what it's like to move without supervision. The reinforced screens on the windows watch you go, but for the first time in weeks, no one is following behind. The forests beyond the hospital property seem to stretch out forever, dark and inviting. Lakes glimmer in the distance through the trees. Your hour is almost up. Time to head back to the ward, back to your medication schedule, back to the routine that's supposed to help with your chemical imbalance. But something about the wilderness calls you. Because in the vast Ontario woods, where help can be hours away, and the forests swallow sound, some walks never end, and some patients simply step into the trees and vanish forever. This is Northern Crimes. On August 24th, 1981, two teenage boys vanished from a farm in Caledon, Ontario, sparking one of Canada's most baffling missing persons cases. 14-year-old Eric Larsfolk and 15-year-old John McCormick Jr. disappeared without a trace on what should have been an ordinary summer evening. They left behind a mystery that has haunted investigators and families for over 4 decades. The story begins with the Larsfolk family's move to rural Ontario. Eric's father, Lloyd Larsfolk, had been forced to close his greenhouse business in Fort Erie due to ongoing disputes with the city over rezoning issues. Seeking a fresh start, the family relocated to a farmhouse on Horseshoe Hill Road in Caledon, just outside Toronto. For Eric, the move represented a significant change, leaving behind friends and familiar surroundings for the quiet isolation of rural life. Eric was a responsible, well-liked teenager who'd recently won a red Timson bicycle at a local Dairy Queen contest. He was active in Scouts Canada, enjoyed fishing, and had dreams of one day owning his own business. His older brother David described him as someone who rarely caused trouble and always followed his parents' rules. The McCormick family lived nearby on a 100-acre farm. John McCormick Jr. was a mechanically gifted 15-year-old who loved working on cars. In fact, he'd collected 6 to 8 old vehicles that he meticulously maintained. However, his home life was troubled. His father, John McCormick Sr., was a severe alcoholic who lived in a carpeted bedroom with a refrigerator beside his bed, drinking from morning until night. The relationship between father and son was volatile, sometimes even violent. Earlier that summer, John Jr. had been sent to stay with relatives in Virginia after a particularly brutal fight with his father that resulted in a broken arm. He'd only returned to the farm 10 days before his disappearance, and tensions remained high between him and his father. On the evening of August 24th, Eric's older brother David was supposed to be home, but had decided to stay an extra night with friends in Fort Erie. When John Jr. came to the Lars Volk house looking for David, he found Eric instead. Despite barely knowing each other, the two boys decided to hang out for the evening. Eric rode his new bicycle to the McCormick farm where John Jr. planned to show him around the property in one of his field cars. The boys took an old black Chevrolet and drove around the farm property. John Jr.'s 13-year-old sister Kim saw them leave around 6 p.m. before she departed for a babysitting job. When she returned at 9 p.m., she noticed one of John's vans was leaking oil in the driveway, something that would absolutely infuriate their father. She went looking for her brother to warn him about the leak, but couldn't find either boy anywhere. What Kim did find was deeply unsettling. The black Chevrolet field car sat abandoned at the entrance to a gravel pit on the property. The hood was up, the door was open, the wires lay neatly arranged on the driver's seat. The car required 2 people to start, one to work under the hood, while the other manipulated the wires, suggesting the boys had been in the process of restarting the vehicle when something interrupted them. Around 11 p.m., Joyce McCormick, John Jr.'s mother, burst into the Lars Volk home in panic. She'd returned from her nursing shift to find her son missing and immediately suspected that something was wrong. Lloyd Lars Volk joined the search, and by midnight, police had been summoned to investigate. The initial response was frustratingly typical of the era. Police suggested the boys had likely run away to attend the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, despite the Lars Volk family's insistence that Eric would never leave without permission. The theory persisted even though neither boy had taken any belongings, money, or even change of clothes. As the investigation progressed, attention focused on 2 primary suspects: John McCormick Sr.'s violent history and the family's suspicious behavior after the disappearance raised immediate red flags. Even more concerning was the family's response to their son's disappearance. Within a week, they'd packed up John Jr.'s room and refused to cooperate with media or provide photographs for missing person posters.
With Whoop, start improving your fitness from day one with real-time insights and guidance built around your goals. See where Whoop can take you.
The second suspect was George McCullough, a local handyman who worked odd jobs around the McCormick farm. Known to the family as, quote, the Weasel, McCullough was feared by Joyce McCormick and Kim, who found him threatening and untrustworthy. On the night of the disappearance, witnesses observed McCullough's truck covered in red clay, and his coveralls bore similar stains, significant because the gravel pit area contained deposits of distinctive red clay. Despite searches over the following months, no trace of the boys was ever found. The case has been featured on Unsolved Mysteries and continues to generate theories and speculation. Some investigators believe the boys were murdered and their bodies disposed of in the gravel pit, possibly using heavy machinery to bury them beyond the reach of conventional searches. The contrast between the 2 families' responses remains one of the most haunting aspects of this case. While Lloyd Larsfolk spent decades searching for his son, returning annually to Caledon to look for answers until his death, the McCormick family's silence spoke volumes. They moved away and refused all contact with investigators and journalists. The Caledon disappearances remain one of Canada's most disturbing cold cases. Eric Larsfolk and John McCormick Jr. vanished at a pivotal moment in their young lives, leaving behind unanswered questions and grieving families. Their case highlights the challenges facing rural investigations and the lasting impact when justice remains elusive.
Alright, that's enough.